Mark talking to us from New York. Mark, you are live on Talk Heathen. What is going on?
Hey guys, how's it going?
Going okay.
Fantastic, dude.
So I just good. I just found the channel, and I'm very happy to have found it. You seem like you have a great show and a great program here.
Thank you.
I was just typing some things into the chat, and some of the folks there encouraged me to call in and kind of tell my story.
Great.
So I decided to do that because yeah.
Wonderful. We always like it when folks call in based on what the chat is suggesting to do. Like, those make pretty good conversations most of the time. No, seriously, they do. They're really good.
Audience interaction going.
We're happy to hear it.
Oh, true.
Yeah.
True. I love the chat. I'm a big proponent of the chat. So yeah, so it is my first time, listening to the program. So pardon, if I'm somewhat of a novice in terms of how you guys run the calls and things like that. But, what's happened to me is that I've sort of gone from being a believer as, a young kid, kind of getting indoctrinated, I guess you would say, to turning to science. And, when I was a teenager, I read A Brief History of Time. My dad had the book.
Yeah.
And
that's the book that got me into science. Yeah. Love that.
Really?
Yeah,
exactly. I'm sure a lot of people did as well. So, I was really interested in cosmology, and as I got a little bit older, I went to college and graduate school. I think I tended really to be more. I think I leaned more from agnostic to even atheist at certain points. I just wasn't really. I just didn't feel the belief inside of me. And from sort of a knowledge level, it seemed like there were more answers in science than anything else. And I just never really looked to religion as something that would provide sort of the ultimate answers that I think I was seeking.
Hard agree, bro. Yeah. What a great show. All right, well, that's our time.
Wrap it up
there.
So what ended up actually happening, coincidentally, was when COVID happened, we started working from home. I was just on the computer a lot. I was listening to YouTube a lot, and I always liked debates. And so I just found I went looking actually for debates between atheists and theists, like apologists. And I was kind of trying to keep an open mind. And part of me wonders if I'm a little biased to some extent, things like Pascal's wager and things like that. But I've tried to keep an open mind about it, and it could be just the things I've been listening to, and the debates I've been following. But it seems to me like that there is a stronger there's a stronger line of reasoning on the theist side than there is on the atheist side. And so that's where I kind of landed. I don't really feel it in my heart.
All right.
But just from a logical perspective, that's where I kind of landed.
So, Mark,
I want to talk about it.
Yeah. So talking about that, is it because of Pascal's wager in particular, or is it some other kind of line of reasoning that has convinced you of this?
It's another line of reasoning. And I mentioned Pascal's wager just because that might be something that's sort of like an unconscious thing going on in the background.
Sure.
Maybe, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
But, no, it's really... Yeah.
Lay the logic on us.
Yeah.
I want to hear this.
No, absolutely. So the one argument, like the cosmological argument, I find as a pretty good argument either, and I know there's sort of various forms of that, but I've always liked philosophy, and so that those kinds of arguments appeal to me somewhat, and just sort of this argument that where does being come from? And it seems to me that the atheist doesn't really have an explanation.
So just so we're clear on the same page here, cosmological argument is the idea that there's order to the universe, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We just double checked. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. We're saying the same thing you're saying, because if you mean something different, it's going to be a weird call.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, I'm glad you did that because I think I think there's various forms of the cosmological argument.
Yes, there are.
I think Leibniz put forward. Yeah. So the one there's sort of this ultimate one, which is why is there anything at all?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And and then I guess the explanation is, well, God is the explanation for that. Which it's not really, to me, a fully satisfactory answer, because then you still kind of wonder, like, where did God come from?
Right.
But to me, it's a little bit better than having no answer at all. And at least with God, it's not a material. You're not talking about something material. So if you don't. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have some thoughts. So you mentioned that you might have some biases in there, and the truth is we all have biases, right?
Sure.
And I think that's important that you pointed that out. And I'm really glad, because that means you're honest with yourself. We all want to be honest with ourselves. What you said was just right now is interesting. It's better that there is an answer than there isn't one at all. And that is a bias, right? That is a bias of human beings. Yeah. We want there to be an answer to something, even when we don't have all the best information to make a decision on something. And I think this is a very popular case where this happens. I think a lot of people feel the same way. I think a lot of people are like, well, I'd rather there be something than nothing when talking about this. Now, when we talk about the cosmological argument, we're talking about ultimately an argument that relies on metaphysics. And metaphysics is outside, of course, the realm of science, right? Yeah. It doesn't say, like, our investigative methodologies and principles are not going to be applicable to any kind of argument that's made on metaphysical grounds. So when it comes to metaphysics, Forrest and I, we're not the biggest fans, I would say.
You could lump me into the non-fans for sure.
Because you can make any kind of argument with a metaphysical argument. Honestly, you can say that it's pink unicorns that made the universe. Really, this idea that we have of God comes from a classical Western tradition idea of God that we kind of unconsciously put into these arguments, even though if you look at like what a baseline cosmological argument is saying, it really has nothing to do with the Christian God. It has nothing to do with any traditional concept of that God. It's talking about a being that is completely unidentifiable for any major world religion. And maybe that's where you are. Maybe you're not. Maybe that's what you're saying. Maybe you're not a traditional Christian. Maybe you're coming at a different place from that. But like, it really doesn't inform us anything about what we can observe in the universe. It's just an idea, you know? We might as well be saying, oh, we all come from a supercomputer, or we all come from aliens. You know, like unless we have any hard, definable way of talking about that in any material words or material ways, we're taking ideas out of thin air. You know, and that's how I feel about the cosmological argument in general and most variations of it. It doesn't say much.
Yeah, I would also point out that, like, I think you hit the nail on the head there when we were saying, like, you can apply it to anything. It's like, that's, people talk to me all the time, like, how do you know we're not in a simulation? It's the same thing. It's an unfalsifiable claim.
Right.
There's no way, even if I could give you proof positive that we're not in a simulation, you could then say that proof is part of the simulation too. And even if I were to wake up from the simulation, you could then say you're now in level 2 of the simulation. And it's the same thing with this. Anything that I could do to prove that there's no God, if that was possible, you could then say that too is part of the organized structure of the whatever. Yep. And like, what bothers me the most about it is that I entirely hear what you're saying about, like, it sucks that we may not have an answer, but I'd rather be honest and say that I don't know. Like, I'm on the complete opposite side of the fence from you. I don't know what happened before the Big Bang, because I don't think what happened before the Big Bang is even a question that makes logical sense when you understand what the Big Bang is. And so, like, here's this area that, like, I have no even comprehension of what question I'm allowed to ask within the confines of physics. I don't know what that is, but that doesn't mean I'm happy. It keeps me up at night. I'm itching to know. It kills me that I don't know. Yeah. But I'd rather just say I don't know than make something up and then have to, like, work with that for my whole life and then be wrong later. You know what I mean?
Yeah, a lot of words from us. What do you think about that, Tom?
Right.
Or Mark, sorry.
So those are great points. Those are great points, and I would have two responses. One, just as an initial thing, is that it somewhat seems like it leaves you with agnosticism, because you're left saying, I don't know.
Sure.
And there's not this strong affirmative case saying there is no God. Okay. So that's just one point I would just mention.
Right. Yeah. And if you really want to, we can get into the meaning of that word and whether you're in, like, it's a qualifier or a separate thing.
Many of us use the terminology agnostic, atheist to philosophically put a fine point on our positions. Yeah. So that's also a thing, which is confusing for people.
Fair enough.
It is frustrating.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to get real pedantic, we'd love to, but we don't have to.
Yeah. But your second point, go ahead, Mark.
Okay. All right. So the second point on the metaphysical argument and sort of the value of that. See, the way I look at it is you ultimately have to, at some point, rely on metaphysics or something beyond science, because you cannot prove science or logic using science or logic. That's just circular.
I disagree.
So you're sort of if you're taking, well, okay, so so can you then explain how you could prove a logical statement without relying on logic?
Right. Well, the whole point of science and logic is that it's something that gets you out of your own way. It stops you from allowing your biases to interfere with your reasoning. That's the whole point of the scientific method. That's the whole point of logical and critical thinking. Like, that's what they're for. And so, like, those things have a history, a demonstrable history of giving us factual information and of teaching us things that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise. You know what I mean? So, like, if you look at,
I agree with that.
So like that's if I wouldn't say that it's circular to then say, like, I can use the scientific method to fact check my own science and make sure that I'm on the right track here, because that's not circular. That's just using the same method.
Let me draw an analogy. Roger Penrose wrote, I think it was called The Emperor's New Clothes or something like that.
The Emperor has no clothes.
He has this theory of consciousness. The Emperor has no clothes, right?
Yeah.
He has this theory of consciousness with Stuart Hameroff, right? And he bases it on Gödel's incompleteness theorem,
right?
Which shows that for any system of arithmetic, right, there's going to be truth statements that cannot be demonstrated using that system.
Yeah.
So, what Penrose does is basically, right, so he kind of uses that as a model to say consciousness isn't computational,
right,
because it involves understanding. And there's something deeper going on with understanding.
Yes.
And so that's the analogy I'm trying to make when we're bringing it back to can you prove science through science? That's sort of the point I'm trying to make is you need to step outside of the system sometimes to see whether the system is true or not.
So,
and when you look at even the word science, God.
Oh yeah. So Mark, what you're bringing to the table is something that I have encountered quite frequently, actually, probably pretty recently. And I would identify this argumentation as a class of theism that is trying to put consciousness as the center of sort of your epistemology, right? So, we can talk about Gödel's incompleteness theorem and stuff and get really hard in the paint about epistemic ideas. But for those who aren't aware, it's just this idea that mathematics itself, logical systems in itself, can't prove itself, right? That seems to be the conclusion that that these things make, right? So let's say that that's true. Let's say that Gödel's incompleteness theorem talks about this and talks about all these systems as being incomplete. That doesn't take away the value of these systems in their ability to predict phenomenon and the ability to demonstrate, phenomenon happening within a certain way, right? So even though these systems may not be perfect and they may not be able to prove themselves, we really don't have any other method. So to go and say, well, we have to base it on consciousness, it has to be something supernatural. That in itself is not an explanation. It doesn't close the gap of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I think this is the problem that I see when I see Christians make this point. There are some thoughtful Christians who've really thought about this and think that this somehow demonstrates the truthiness or the sort of basis, the baseline strata of consciousness or the baseline strata of a God being the place where we find all knowledge or that we find all logic or that we find all understanding. But it's not. It's kind of just like another idea in a stew of ideas. You know what I mean? Like you still have to make the positive claim that this is the basis. This is where we get it from. And I've yet to see that from people who argue from your line of position. Perhaps you do have the answer, but I don't see that. Does that make sense?
Well,
I know it's a little complicated.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And the way you just formulated it, I agree with what you just said. Okay. I was coming at it, and it's because I'm not making that strong of a case. Yeah. I was just coming at it more from defending the value of metaphysics.
Yeah.
And just in terms of, because even the word metaphysics, it's like it's trying to stepping outside of physics, and I don't think I would go as far as you postulated it earlier. It seemed to me like you were almost saying, look, this is a metaphysical argument, doesn't really add much to the equation. And when if you look at the word science, it used to just mean knowledge.
Yes.
And, it's now kind of evolved into this materialistic methodology where I think it's much more narrow.
Yeah.
And it's limiting. If you're only going to look at purely scientific in sort of this modern way that we use the term, information for knowledge,
yes,
I think you're somewhat limiting yourself.
in some ways I would agree with you, but
I'm almost like trying to make the argument that.
yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Mark, but I only because we kind of have to wrap up this call in a bit here. But I think where I get into the disagreement with folks who go down this route of the metaphysics route is when we talk about consciousness. I understand consciousness as being a material, physical phenomenon, right? And so if I understand it as a physical, material phenomenon, then science does actually give us a basis, and science can give us kind of a central understanding for a lot of the things that we talk about within consciousness. I think there's evidence of this. I could talk about this, but I do make that claim. Now, of course, there's a lot of people who practice metaphysics who disagree with that and say consciousness is something else and is outside of itself and therefore can be used as a baseline. I disagree with that. I don't know if we have time to go into it, to be honest with you, Mark, but there is, there are folks like me who do think like I do, and that's what I would say. My response with that to be would, go ahead. What's that?
Are you and just allow me to challenge you on this if you may. Do you think you're coming to that conclusion? Are you somewhat putting the cart before the horse? Or are you arriving at that conclusion because you're an atheist or agnostic, and that is what...
I think a Christian can understand that your consciousness is completely based on material phenomena. For example, if I hit Forrest over the head with a hammer and I give him permanent brain injury, your consciousness is going to be affected.
Yeah. I will fundamentally change as a person. No
ifs, ands, or buts about it. And what I've done is I've changed the physical characteristics of Forrest. In other words, the material phenomenon that's producing his consciousness has been fundamentally altered, and therefore there has to be a physical basis of consciousness. Now, there are some people that will say, well, the soul exists outside of the body. The soul is like you're like a radio transmitter. You're just receiving that. But there's no evidence of that.
Yeah.
There is no evidence of that. There's been no ways to demonstrate how that could be true. Again, it's just another idea, and that's the problem, is that it's unfalsifiable. We go back into this realm of not being able to show one way or another which idea could be true or not true. Does that make sense, Mark?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does, and you're right. There's no evidence of that, and I would say just like if an Aborigine found a radio and he started listening to it, he would have no evidence that there's electromagnetic waves and there's a tower somewhere, and it might take him a long time to figure that out. And the interim all he sees is the radio, like you said, with that analogy.
Yeah.
And so it works. It kind of cuts both ways. I mean, we also have no evidence of how we have no model. They're not even in the stratosphere of explaining how consciousness could be epiphenomenal.
Well, yeah.
So it's just a lot of hand waving going on.
Right.
And they don't have a model to do that. So I think it cuts both ways, and and
I can clone an animal. We can clone human beings, and they're going to have a consciousness. So either we just, it really just kind of breaks down this idea of where we're getting that consciousness from. It seems to be a material phenomenon. That seems to be it. But I'm sorry, Mark, we are running out of time for this call. We're already going really over. I have to cut you off now, but I really appreciate what you brought to the discussion.